Margaret Chen had built her empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a billion-dollar conglomerate that touched millions of lives. But success had left her feeling hollow, disconnected from the very humanity she claimed to serve. Sitting in her corner office 50 floors above Manhattan, she watched people hurry along the sidewalks like ants, and wondered if anyone truly cared about anything beyond themselves anymore. The weight of cynicism pressed down on her chest like a stone, making each breath feel labored. At 62, she had everything money could buy, yet felt poorer than she had as a struggling immigrant child sharing a one-bedroom apartment with her parents and 3 siblings. The idea struck her during a sleepless Tuesday night in March. What if she could test the very thing she'd lost faith in, human goodness? What if she could discover whether kindness still existed in a world that seemed increasingly driven by greed and self-interest? The concept was simple yet profound. Give 4 strangers unlimited spending power and see what they revealed about the human heart. Margaret selected her subjects carefully over several weeks of observation. First was David Rodriguez, a young investment banker whose BMW and designer suits couldn't hide the hunger in his eyes, the same desperation she remembered from her own climb to the top. Second was Jessica Williams, a social media influencer whose perfect Instagram life masked something deeper that Margaret recognized but couldn't quite name. Third was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a successful surgeon whose charitable donations appeared regularly in society pages, though Margaret wondered about the motivation behind such public generosity. And then there was Jerome Washington. Margaret had noticed the janitor during her late-night walks through the building. While others rushed past with barely a glance, Jerome always nodded respectfully, his weathered face creased with genuine warmth. She'd seen him share his lunch with a homeless man outside, slip extra bills into the Christmas fund for struggling employees, and stay hours past his shift to help a young intern who'd spilled coffee on important documents. There was something about his quiet dignity that stirred memories of her father, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep their family afloat yet never lost his capacity for kindness. On a gray Monday morning, Margaret's assistant delivered identical black envelopes to all 4 individuals. Inside each was a sleek black credit card with no spending limit and a simple note: "You have 48 hours to spend however you choose. There are no restrictions, no questions asked, and no consequences. This is a gift with only one request: be yourself." David was the first to act, his hands trembling slightly as he read the note. Within an hour, he'd purchased a Rolex Submariner, a weekend in the Hamptons, and a bottle of Dom Perignon that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His social media exploded with photos of his sudden windfall, each post carefully curated to project success and status. By evening, he'd spent $37,000 on things designed to impress people he barely knew. Jessica's approach was more calculated but equally self-focused. She bought a professional camera setup worth $12,000, commissioned custom jewelry for upcoming photo shoots, and booked a luxury retreat in Tulum that would provide content for months. Her purchases were investments in her brand, her image, her carefully constructed online persona. She documented everything, turning even this mysterious gift into content that would generate likes, shares, and ultimately, more money. Dr. Mitchell surprised Margaret with her restraint. The surgeon spent modestly, a nice dinner with colleagues, a donation to the hospital's children's wing that would certainly be acknowledged publicly, and a weekend spa package. Her purchases seemed almost calculated for their appearance of humility, each one defensible and respectable. Margaret found herself wondering if the doctor's caution came from genuine modesty or simply a more sophisticated understanding of how to manage appearances. Then there was Jerome. The janitor stared at the black card for nearly an hour, turning it over in his calloused hands as if it might disappear. Margaret watched through security cameras as he sat at his small desk in the building's basement, his lunch forgotten, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. His first stop wasn't to a luxury store or high-end restaurant. Jerome walked 6 blocks to a medical supply store, where he spent 43 minutes consulting with a pharmacist about specialized equipment. His purchase: a custom wheelchair for his neighbor's 8-year-old daughter, whose family had been saving for 2 years to afford the mobility device their insurance wouldn't cover. The little girl, Maria, had been born with spina bifida, and Jerome had watched her struggle with an old, uncomfortable chair that limited her independence. But Jerome wasn't finished. His next stop was the local grocery store, where he filled not one but 7 carts with staples, rice, beans, canned goods, baby formula, diapers. The store manager looked bewildered as Jerome arranged for everything to be delivered to the community center where he volunteered on weekends, feeding families who often went without meals toward the end of each month. Margaret found herself leaning forward in her chair as she tracked Jerome's movements through the transaction reports flowing across her screen. Each purchase told a story she hadn't expected, revealing a network of people whose lives this quiet man had somehow woven himself into. At the children's hospital across town, Jerome spent 3 hours with doctors and administrators, ultimately funding a year's worth of art therapy sessions for young cancer patients. He'd learned about the program's funding crisis from Dr. Mitchell herself, who'd mentioned it in passing during one of their brief conversations in the elevator. The sessions provided joy and emotional outlet for children facing unimaginable challenges, but the hospital couldn't afford to continue them. As evening approached, Margaret watched Jerome make one final stop. At a small automotive shop in his neighborhood, he quietly paid off the repair bills for 6 different customers, working parents whose cars had broken down but who couldn't afford the fixes they needed to get to work. The shop owner, tears in his eyes, tried to refuse the payment, but Jerome insisted, asking only that the customers never know who had helped them. By the time 48 hours had elapsed, Jerome had spent over $60,000. Not a single purchase had been for himself. Margaret sat in her office as the sun set over the city, reports spread across her desk like pieces of a puzzle that had finally revealed its picture. David had spent on status symbols that would depreciate and be forgotten. Jessica had invested in her image, her brand, her carefully constructed online presence. Dr. Mitchell had made respectable, measured choices that maintained her reputation while providing modest help to others. And Jerome had seen unlimited resources and thought immediately of unlimited opportunities to lift others up. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She designed this test expecting to confirm her worst fears about human nature, to prove that given unlimited power, people would reveal their fundamental selfishness. Instead, she'd discovered something that made her chest tight with an emotion she'd almost forgotten how to feel. When Jerome answered her call, his voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Ms. Chen, did I do something wrong with that card? I can pay you back, I've got some savings." "Jerome," Margaret interrupted, her voice thick with unshed tears, "I need to meet with you. There's something I need to tell you, and something I need to ask." The next morning, Jerome sat across from Margaret in her office, looking small and uncomfortable in the leather chair that had hosted Fortune 500 CEOs and world leaders. Margaret had spent the night wrestling with a decision that would change everything. "Jerome, that card wasn't a mistake or a random gift. It was a test, and you," she paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate, "you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. You reminded me why I started this company in the first place, not to accumulate wealth, but to make a difference." Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city that had made her rich but left her spiritually bankrupt. "I'm restructuring everything, Jerome. This company, my foundation, my entire approach to business. And I want you to help me do it. Not as a janitor, but as my partner in remembering what really matters." Jerome's eyes widened, but Margaret continued before he could speak. "You see people, Jerome. Really see them. You notice who's struggling, who needs help, who's been overlooked. That's rarer than any business degree or MBA. That's wisdom." 6 months later, the Chen Foundation had transformed from a traditional charity writing checks for tax benefits into a revolutionary organization that identified and supported everyday heroes like Jerome. Under his guidance, they'd funded community programs, supported struggling families, and created networks of mutual aid that strengthened entire neighborhoods. Margaret had found her purpose again, but more than that, she'd found hope. In a world that often seemed dark and divided, Jerome had shown her that kindness wasn't dead, it was simply quiet, humble, and often invisible to those who'd forgotten how to look for it. The black credit card sat in her desk drawer now, a reminder of the day she'd set out to test humanity and instead discovered that sometimes, the most profound tests are the ones we fail at beautifully, learning that our cynicism is no match for the enduring power of human goodness.